Welcome to the Own Your Epic podcast. My name is Jay Dostal, author of the book Own Your Epic, Leadership Lessons in Owning Your Voice and Your Story. In this podcast, I highlight the stories and voices of educators across the country who are making a difference in schools and uncover what makes them exceptional leaders in their field. By sharing the voices and stories of others, we can all learn to appreciate that each of us is the author of our own epic and our experiences are relatable to others, if we are willing to share them. Let's get started on the Own Your Epic process. Welcome to the Own Your Epic podcast. I am excited to have this guest on today. We've been playing tag back and forth, trying to figure out a time to work. But I was joking with her this morning that I think this is probably going to be our most listened to podcast just because she is extremely quick-witted. She's sarcastic. She's a good friend and a colleague of mine, but I'm not going to introduce her. She's going to introduce herself. So why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
I don't know how sarcastic I am, Dr. Dostal, but my name is Sarah Schau. I'm in my 20th-ish year in education. I'm Dean of Students and District Career Coordinator here at Westside.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
You and I actually have a past history too.
Yes, we do.
We taught together a long time ago.
Long time ago.
Back when you were in the business classroom and I was parlaying between English and physical education.
Yeah.
That was a long time ago.
Too long.
I don't think we knew each other very well during that time.
I don't think we did either. I remember seeing you and being really fascinated by the fact that you taught English and PE. Seems like business and history seem to kind of go together, but PE and English? I liked it.
I was a mullet.
Yeah, with hair.
With hair at the time. Business up front, party in the back.
That's right.
So, okay. This is just a conversation.
Okay.
Because I know you get kind of nervous on this.
I am kind of nervous.
And you don't like hearing your voice. You just told me that ahead of time, but you have a wonderful voice. So I think that the reason why I wanted you on this podcast is I think you've got an interesting story and background that a lot of people can relate to, or at least find themselves in your story. And so let's start from like the very beginning. Why did you want to become an educator in the first place?
You know, that's a great question, and I've thought about it a lot. I always remember wanting to be around kids. I taught swim lessons. I always worked at a pool, kind of grew up around kids and finding joy bossing them around. Truly, when I was younger, it was fun. I coached softball when I was in high school for younger kids. So,
did you have brothers and sisters too?
I'm the youngest, so I had to find some people.
So you got bossed around.
For sure.
Okay, so you needed an outlet.
Yeah,
okay.
I feel like I needed an outlet for that. And I remember sitting in an English class with Miss Vogt. Hopefully she won't listen to this because I don't want to offend her because she was one of my favorite teachers. But I remember saying, I think I want to be a high school teacher, Miss Vogt. And she looked directly at me and said, Sarah, you're too smart to be a teacher. And I'll never forget that. I'm like, well, that doesn't make sense. The smartest people I know are teachers. That doesn't make sense. So I went to school for business, naturally. So I went to the University of Northern Iowa, got a marketing degree. About in my junior year of college, I started dating who's now my husband. And we went to his house over the lake I believe that it was Labor Day weekend. And everyone was getting excited to go back to school. And there was a bunch of teachers there. His mom was a teacher. His dad's a former teacher. And they were so excited to get back to school and get back to their kids. And I remember dreading going to my job. I'm like, I'm 22 years old, 21 years old.
What was your job at the time?
I worked in transportation logistics. I made really good money for being 22 years old, but I hated it, right? Because it wasn't at all what I wanted to do. And I had a moment, and I just thought, maybe I could do this too. And so I was engaged at the time, but we weren't married yet. And no kidding, Jay, I went on my lunch break, wrote my letter of resignation, didn't tell Mark, resigned from my job, called UNO to see if I could start classes to become a teacher, went home that day at 5 and was like, honey, I have something to tell you.
How did he handle that?
Well, we're still married
Oh, that's
22 years
good.
later. But
I can just imagine the look on Mark's face like, I'm sorry, you did what?
oh yeah, I don't think he was super happy about it. But yeah, he was really supportive, and he knew that I hated what I was doing. And so yeah, I went to school for 2 more years, got my business teaching degree, and then history, because at that time that you couldn't just be a business teacher.
Right.
Which then actually served me really well, because a lot of Millard West hired me when I taught both, and then when I moved to Westside, they actually had me teach both. So it actually served me quite well to get in the door.
That's interesting, because that's the reason why Millard West hired me, was because I had English and PE, and they didn't have full-time positions for both, but because they were on a 4x4 block schedule, they could utilize me in both.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I know.
Okay.
See, we have more in common than we thought.
We do. Yeah. We do.
Yeah.
So how did you know then that you made the right decision? Like when was that moment that you felt like, yeah, I'm in the right place now?
I did a practicum at Northwest High School with Jerry Glassman, who was the DEC advisor, and I was in my first semester of education classes, and I was sitting in a marketing class, and they were teaching something, and this kid popped off with the funniest comment about a squirrel in the book. And I remember being the adult in the back of the room and just busted out laughing. And at that moment, I'm like, yep, I found my people. I mean, I'm perpetually a 17-year-old boy at heart. Everything they think is funny, I think is funny. And really, I was like, okay, I love this. The energy they're just funny, I laughed every time I would go into a classroom, So
I'm going to bird walk off of this one, and I told you I was going to do this ahead of time, but you said you're perpetually a 17-year-old boy, and just in our conversations about decisions that kids make, that sort of thing, why do you feel that you are best suited for your current role as a dean of students? Like, do you ever just wake up every morning and like, I cannot wait to see what walks through my door today?
Yes, because you can't make it up. I mean, you try to tell your friends what you do on a daily basis, and they don't believe the stories that we tell them. Because, I mean, you know this. Kids are just hilarious, and they do really stupid things. And we're stuck in that year after year after year. We would think that they would grow up, but they don't, because we have the same age of kids every year. So we have the same behaviors. I think I'm best suited because I think that they're funny, and also understand that it's just really part of the maturing process, is for them to be able to make poor choices when it's safe, I guess, for them to do that, so to speak, and hopefully learn from it and then grow as humans. I mean, that's what's fun as a dean, is being able to have the same kids from 9th grade through 12th grade that make bonehead decisions as 9th graders, and then you just have to give them a look the next year, or just a nudge, or in the hallway. That's what I think in this job brings me joy.
And they know that you care about them too.
Absolutely.
Because you invest a lot of time in them.
Yeah.
How has that helped you with your own kids and parenting high school kids?
I mean, number one, I'm exhausted. I don't know how many times I've told parents, like, yeah, I get it. I deal with these kids all day, and then I go home to 2 of my own. Like, I'm exhausted. I also have used this so many times in my life of, if yelling worked, my 2 biological children would be so well behaved, right? I mean, it doesn't work. I try it every day at my house. The dishwasher is still not unloaded. Gavin still doesn't shut the lights off. And so I think maybe in reverse of what you asked me, it has made me a better dean, because I've realized that for me and my style, the authoritarian style does not work for me personally, with my personality. And so while there does come a time where you need to raise your voice, it does not work in changing behavior. And so I've kind of used that in both of my roles as parent and as dean. I've caught myself wanting to just chew my kids out at home. I'm like, what am I doing? Like, I know this doesn't work. I'm doing this because it makes me feel better to yell at my children, but I know it's not going to change their behavior.
That's so interesting, because I remember my first role as an assistant principal, and I was being an administrator, like I was coaching kids who wanted to be there, and of course they didn't want to be there. And so, I was that big, imposing, yelling guy, and it dawned on me probably after about first 6 months, like, that's all this kid hears at home, so what I'm doing is just going to be noise to them. And like, have you ever thought about this? Because I've had this experience, because my kid goes to school here. Have you ever thought how that experience would be if your kids were actually in the same school as you, and how that interaction might be?
Yeah, I think about it a lot. And my children will bring it up, because they'll come to stuff at Westside with me, and they'll either say, I can't believe they like you, I can't believe they like you as Mrs. Schau, Mom. I'm like, well, that's rude. Or other days, my kids are like, we really wish you were our administrator, Mom. So I get both from them. It depends on the interaction. And what's funny now, Gavin's buddies will text me of like, am I going to get suspended for this, Sarah? What would your school do? So it's kind of fun to be in that role, but still be my kid's mom. And I still get to be Sarah in one aspect of my life, and then Mrs. Schau, because they're very different personalities sometimes.
Oh, I think they're very different personalities. In fact, you and I were joking about actually having this podcast in a bar, because I think we would have two very different personalities come out on this.
Lots of beeps.
How do you turn it on and turn it off then? Like, because you're an activator. You like to get things going. Mm-hmm. You're a visionary. You like to think out of the box. You know how to delegate. Do you ever turn it off?
No. I like
it. How does that work with you and Mark?
I know. Well, sometimes it doesn't.
Well, I ask because that's the same with Melanie and me, that, I'm always boom, 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 boom. And she told me at one point that when we first met, we were both type A personalities, and she realized that if our marriage was going to work, she was going to be the one that had to change into kind of the type B, because you can't have the two type A's. So
right.
How does that work for you?
I definitely, with age, I've gotten better and realized that my behaviors can really sway our family dynamic. I'm bossy. I know I'm bossy. And Mark calls me a control freak, which I absolutely am about certain things. That's a great question of what I turn on and off. It's hard. This is what I liken it to. If you've ever been a lifeguard and you go to a pool, you can't turn it off. You're constantly scanning the pool, looking for kids that are potentially drowning. I cannot relax at a swimming pool because I was a lifeguard forever. I feel the same way when I go to
Can you relax at your own swimming pool with the carpet around the...
Yeah, with the rug, the clampets. Yes, I can. Because there's nobody else.
There's nobody else. You're not worried about that. Okay.
But I'll go to my kids' basketball games and I'll see kids acting out, and I so bad want to say stuff, and Mark just looks at me and rolls his eyes. And so that's kind of my cue of like, calm down. You're a mom right now. It's hard to turn it off. It really is.
It is.
It's yeah.
Well, so I've only had the experiences where my kids have been in the same school with me. And so on the one hand, I look at it from their perspective like, oh my gosh, I couldn't even imagine having one of my parents be the principal or be an administrator in school. But at the same time, it's also comforting because they always know that they can come and find me. Mm-hmm. But I find it very difficult to turn it off at home. Mm-hmm. And it isn't until, we engage in conversations at home where my wife says, you're not my boss here.
Right.
Or my kids are like, Dad, you're not my principal right now. You're
right.
my dad. It's like, oh. So yeah, it's those
mm-hmm.
moments where you just have to kind of stop, realize, okay, yeah, it's all right to take this hat off a little bit. But it's tough.
It is hard. We've talked about this before, but we each found spouses that are very good at letting us know what our roles are.
Oh yeah, and they're not shy.
No.
They're not shy about telling us.
No, definitely not. But it's good. I appreciate that, and I think it really helps. keep me balanced. And I tell Mark all the time, because he's never really seen me in this role. And so he assumes I act a certain way at work. I'm like, you have no idea, and that's okay. It's probably a good thing. But I really don't think he has any idea how I act in this role.
Until he listens to this podcast.
Until he listens to
oh my gosh. All right, so I'm going to switch gears on you because this is a topic that you and I have to discuss.
Oh, good.
Because we were talking about it this morning. For those of you listening to this, I shared this with Sarah right when I had transitioned into this role, and we got to talking about golf very early on because Gavin was working at a golf course and she was in a golf league, and so I started talking about how I love playing golf, and I let her know that one of my pet peeves is when I go out on a golf course and I see those golfers who are dressed up really, really flamboyantly, I guess, or just like
extra.
They're extra. They're trying to be noticed. And the thing that bothers me the most is people who wear white belts. Because when I see somebody wearing a white belt, I'm thinking they better be a really good golfer if you're going to be coming out sporting that type of thing. So we have dubbed this a white belt issue because Sarah knows that white belts drive me nuts. And so now I'm going to turn the tables on her and I'm going to ask her what her white belt issue is. So it could be anything. What is your white belt issue? It just drives you nuts, grinds your gears like, oh, why? Why?
Well, I can't wait to talk about this. But first, for everyone listening, I do have to say that Dr. Dostal, this was when your street cred just I was like, okay, I like this guy. I remember leaving that conversation and calling Mark and saying, this is going to work. I love this guy. So funny you say that. Personally, my white belt issue is, when you go to a grocery store or Target or wherever and they have a couple checkers open and you have these long lines and then they open up a new register and the people in the end of the line think all of a sudden that they get to rush to the new register, and I'm always just like, bro, I've been here for 20 minutes. Don't you know how to merge into the open checker? And and you know me well enough to know you can read my face very easily. So I'm sure I'm rolling my face at these people. I'm like, come on, I've been here much longer than you. You don't get to go to the open checker.
Oh my gosh.
So that's my personal white belt.
Wow.
And now you drive everybody nuts now.
That explains so much.
Right?
It does.
I know.
And honestly, the reason why I asked you this question is because I think that everybody has a white belt issue.
Oh yeah.
They just don't want to acknowledge it.
For sure.
As we were getting ready for this, I was waiting for this question. I wanted to ask you this question all day because I knew it was like, oh, we've got to discuss this. What do you think? Now I'm really getting off script here. What
great.
do you think are the most common white belt issues for high school teachers?
Oh, for high school teacher, that's a great question. I think if they were to make a TikTok, and I'm thinking of all the running things that a teacher would say, from a student perspective is, I was there, my backpack was in my bag. That's one that I remember as a teacher. No, you weren't here. You can't put your bag down and then count that as being here. And then I think a white belt issue for a lot of teachers would be just asking them to do more and more and more and more stuff of all the different initiatives. And I think it would be actually a really funny progression of things if you ask them of all the different initiatives that we
and ones that really are, there's no explanation for where they're going. It's just, we're asking you. So it's like busy work.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Don't you think?
I think, well, I do. And I mean, I also think that, and it's been interesting this year, and our conversations with our teachers have been always provide the why. We're not going to ask you to do something that we wouldn't be willing to do ourselves. And so I think that's the importance of giving the why. But when I start thinking of white belt issues for me were so annoying. It was always the same kid who would walk in 3 seconds after the bell rang consistently. And I knew they were outside. It was just, come on. Or the kid who would try to play off that they actually did the work and they were trying to BS me in the process. And it still is kind of a white belt issue for me because, and I tell my wife this all the time, I don't think a lot of our students know the type of student that I was growing up in high school, that I probably did a lot of the things that you're doing and came up with all of the excuses that I could to get out of trouble. And so I know what you're doing before you are even, like, again, we talk about this all the time. I'm going to ask you questions that I already know the answers to.
Right.
So there's no point in trying to bluff me because I know what you're going to be bluffing on. So that's kind of a white belt issue for me, is those kids who think that they can outsmart you with trying to maintain the story that isn't there. And I'm sure that most teachers would probably feel the exact same way.
I think so too. I think the biggest for all of us in education, and maybe just everywhere, is time. It's our most valued resource, is our time. And so
don't waste our time.
Don't waste our time. Don't waste our time with meetings that you could have sent an email.
Yeah.
You know, don't waste my time with this. Start on time, end on time. And that's what I was going to say professionally for me is my time. It's the one thing that I valued the most. And so when I feel as though people are not valuing my time, that's when I get fussy, right? And so I try my best then to value other people's time.
Well, I was going to ask you, how do you respect that value with the people that you work with, that you are supervising, and that sort of? So how do you take that and practice it so that you are not doing to them what you want so much for yourself?
Yeah, Lois taught me the best trick ever, which seems so simple, but I have about 9,000 alarms set on my phone. And so if I say I'm going to meet with someone at 9 o'clock, I'm going to be there at 8:59 ready to go. And I'm going to end, even if we're not done, I'm going to end when I said we were going to end, just to value that time. Because I mean, I was a teacher for 18 years, so I understand when you have an extra 20 minutes, you're going to use that extra 20 minutes. And I don't want to take that time away from whoever it is that I'm meeting with, students included. You know, kids value their time.
Right.
So I try to be conscious of that to the best of my ability. I'm sure I'm not perfect, but I definitely try.
Work in progress.
Work in progress, yeah.
All right. So thankfully, well, at least you told me you did. So I don't know if you actually did or not. But I know you have a copy of my book. But two of the very important steps in the Own Your Epic process are to curate and cultivate your story so you can amplify your voice. What is that one story that continually comes up to you that you find yourself telling others about you and your journey? Is there one or two those moments that you just feel like you have to convey to others to help them get to know who you are as a person, as an educator, that sort of thing?
Yeah, you know, when I taught marketing too and leadership development and things like that, the one thing I always wanted students to know, and you kind of alluded to this too, is my experience growing up and in high school was not easy. My parents got divorced. We had no money. I think students and even other adults will sometimes look at me in particular and have judgments based on how they think my life might have gone. And that's natural. We all do that with everybody. Sure. But I especially liked to share that with my students of, like, I get it. You know, I have a parent who is an alcoholic. I went through a divorced family life. I went through having to work to buy my own prom dress. I went through, and again, it's not a sob story by any means, but I think that being able to relate some of those stories to our students is really, really important, because they see successful adults around them and don't know how you got from point A to point B. And just kind of explaining that we all have trauma, we all have a process of growth, we all have. And then another thing too that I'm not ashamed of is I'll tell other adults that are struggling that I went to therapy and I wish I would have gone before I was 44. You know, and I'm not ashamed to say that, because sometimes we need to have someone else help us process what we went through as kids and young adults and things like that. So probably TMI, but that's right now the story that I would tell people to understand me more is, yeah, I'm 45 years old and still kind of dealing with things that I went through when I was the age of our kids now.
And see, I don't think that is too much information. Honestly, I think that is what I don't think a lot of practicing educators embrace enough of, is being vulnerable enough to share their stories with their students, to say, listen, because I mean, we work with high school students on a daily basis. High school sucks. I mean, it's like a really difficult time. As much as we'd like to put on this facade that, yeah, everything is rosy and perfect, and kids nowadays are looking at what they're seeing on social media, it's supposed to look this way. It doesn't look that way. Everybody's got that. And so being vulnerable enough to share those stories about, hey, listen, we got through this, and we can still be successful. I don't think there's enough of that, because, and this is why this podcast is so important to me, is to, one, let other people tell their stories, but then if that sparks them to maybe open up and be a little bit more vulnerable with the students that they teach, they might actually find more success with their kids, because their kids now know, oh, Ms. Schau had some of the same background as I did. Dr. Dostal had the same background as I did, and look at where they're at. They may not become a dean of students or a high school teacher, a high school principal, whatever, but if they know that if they can get through that, then I might have a chance at this as well. And I think that's where we sometimes fall short in education, is we're not willing to open up about that, or pick and choose the items that we want to talk about. So
yeah,
wow.
I agree. I don't know when that changed or flipped in my teaching, but I realized that, like, that was my teacher's superpower, is being vulnerable in front of my kids. And I learned that by sharing stuff about me personally, and not everything, of course, obviously there's boundaries when you're in education, but just sharing those little nuggets, I'm like, wow, did that help with my classroom management?
Yeah.
I don't have to yell anymore, because they see me as a human and they don't want to disappoint the human side of me.
Yeah.
And so that, it started to just become easier. And then I understood the power of relationships with kids. And my teaching just got so much easier. I could focus on things I wanted to, instead of seating charts and,
And see, that's interesting, because I think you go into education thinking you've got, because you have all your pedagogy and the methods and all that stuff. They really don't teach you that side, because I can tell you exactly when it changed for me. I was teaching composition and literature at Millard West, so this was in the course guide. It actually said this is the course for non-college bound seniors, the English course for non-college bound seniors, which that's a different story for another
that's
day.
Another podcast.
But first year teaching, and I still remember the young lady in the front row. Her name's Lauren, and she raised her hand. She says, "How old are you?" I said, "I'm 22. And then she tapped into the person next, "Our teacher's as old as your boyfriend." And I'm just sitting there going, okay, this is real now. Like, what in the world? What am I going through? And it was at that moment, it's like, all right, I've got to throw all of this stuff out here. If I'm going to relate to these kids, I've at least got to talk their language and speak their language. And fortunately, at the time, I still had those relative shared experiences. Now at 45, trying to relate to an 18-year-old other than my own kids is really difficult. So how do you compensate for that? You got to get real with them and talk about your own experiences. So that's cool.
It is.
All right, so we're at 28 minutes.
Oh, that went way too fast.
I know, it's just a conversation. So I want to ask you one follow-up or one more question. It's just kind of the capstone to this, because education is tough. You know it. Doesn't matter what role you have in education, it's tough. And we have a lot of people who are leaving the profession, and not a lot of people who are coming back in. And so I guess my question for you is, for someone who's been in a school for now 20 years, 22, 23 years, 20, something like that. We're getting up there, I forgot. And you've seen all these highs and lows from both a classroom perspective and administrative perspective. What advice do you have for educators who are listening to this podcast, whether they are just coming in or they're thinking about leaving? Like, what's the best advice that you can give them?
Oh, that's so hard, because I think I'd give different advice to each.
Well, we got time.
Right.
What's the advice?
I mean, new teachers coming into the profession, the advice I would give is figure out early how to maintain that work-life balance, because you remember, I mean, all we did when you're a first-year teacher is think about school, and I think there's a part of that needs to stay, but creating those boundaries so that you do have that time to take care of yourself in a profession that has a lot of secondary trauma. We bring a lot of stuff home. We're in it because we care. It becomes emotionally overbearing at times, but starting young and having that work-life balance hopefully will keep more young people in the profession, because we can keep them healthy and mentally healthy, because it is so fun and it's so rewarding. And everything about education, I don't love everything, but what I do love is the kids.
Right.
And if we can keep the focus on that and not the background noise, hopefully we'll get more people to stay in the profession. And those thinking about leaving, some it's time. For some people it is time, because if the focus does become about other things that aren't kids, then maybe it is time.
If you don't have joy for the job anymore.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't love kids anymore, it might be time. But for those maybe just seeking pay or seeking other things, my advice, is the grass isn't always greener. And what is it about this job that is challenging? And then, maybe working from that angle is, do you need other roles and responsibilities within that job? Do you want to take on something that brings you joy? As the conversation we just had prior to this podcast, is to really think long and hard, because every single one of us in education has thought about leaving before. We just have.
Yeah. It's
hard. We could get paid more somewhere else. But I always come back to, what else would I do where I get to laugh every day and, get to tell bad jokes to kids and think I'm funny and those types of things. So the advice to people leaving is it really worth more money if you're not going to be as happy?
Right.
And maybe some people will be more happy, or be happier, I guess. You're the English teacher. Fix my grammar there. Yeah, thank you. It's hard, because there is a mass exodus right now. And a lot of it is, I think, pay.
It is. And I get it, because you have to support your family. You have to be able to do those things, and you have to be able to find enjoyment in what you do, and at least be compensated and know what your worth is. And I think that we have reached that critical point where I thought we were going to have that during the pandemic, when kids had to stay home and people were like, oh my gosh, now I know what teachers have. No.
Right.
You saw a small sample of that. Mm-hmm. That's every day of every year of a school teacher. And so, no, I think that's a good point. It's a good way to end the conversation for today. And I want to thank you for taking the time to do this. I know that was really quick, but it was so good to be able to have this conversation. I learned a little bit more about you. We work together on a daily basis. And I have come up in my mind right now that you and I are going to co-author a book called White Belt Issues in Education.
Sign me up.
And you and I are going to start a Google Doc, and we're just going to start writing our ideas down. I guarantee you it's going to be a #1 bestseller. It's going to be fantastic.
Sign me up.
Well, Sarah, you're awesome. Thank you so much for doing this. Everybody, that is the end of this episode of the Own Your Epic podcast. Stay tuned for more episodes, and as always, head on over to ownyourepic.blogspot.com. Check out other podcasts as well as blogs, and pick up the book. And we'll talk to everybody next time.
Thank you for joining me on today's podcast. To find out more about Own Your Epic, check out my website at ownyourepic.blogspot.com, where you can purchase my book or subscribe to all the latest blog and podcast updates. Until next time, own your epic and share your voice and your story. It matters and can make a difference in the lives of others.